Action Park was the most dangerous amusement park of all times, but it was also the best park this world has ever known. Let me explain. So, it's the 1970s and Wall Street is flooded with greedy pigs scamming clueless investors with pump and dump schemes. Even among them, Eugene Mulvihill stands as an eccentric man, and he eventually gets banned from Wall Street because of his scams. But before that, he was able to make a ton of money, and with it, he decides to buy an unremarkable ski resort in New Jersey. And during winter, it's great. Many people go skiing and they fill up hotels, restaurants, and whatnot. But during summer, the resort is basically empty, and that's a big problem for Gene. So, to attract more people in summer, he builds an alpine slide, and this is an instant success. In fact, it works so well that he decides to add water slides, and with one thing leading to another, an entire amusement park is built. This is Action Park, and it's going to be unlike any other park. So forget about Disneyland and Universal. Gene is full of crazy ideas, and he has the money to turn them into reality. So when Action Park finally opens, it quickly becomes one of the main attractions in the greater New York area, especially among teenagers. But soon, problems start to pile up. Rides don't work, fights break out, people get injured, lawsuits accumulate, and some guests even lose their lives. But here is the thing. There is no way the outcome could have been any different. These disasters were all expected. Dare I say, it was intentional, meant to be this way. And it starts with how the attractions were designed. For example, take a look at what is probably the most iconic attraction of the park. It's called the Cannonball Loop, and it took many years before it was open to the public, but not for the reasons you may expect. I know, this water slide looks like it's straight out of a cartoon, and there is a good reason why you don't normally find this kind of slide in the real world. You see, Gene thought it'd be fun to have a slide with a loop, so he built one. And you'd think, oh, okay, he called a company specialized in the conception of water slides, or maybe he hired a bunch of engineers to design the ride. But no, he just drew his idea on a piece of paper and handed that to some construction workers. And to test it, Gene and his staff just threw a bunch of test dummies into the slide. But it didn't go very well. As it turns out, the test dummies came out the other end of the slide without their heads or with missing limbs. But instead of giving up on this crazy idea, Gene simply tried to make adjustments. So they changed the angle of the slide, its height, and tried different water pressures. Basically, they just ran a bunch of experiments until the test dummies were able to go through the entire slide and come out mostly intact most of the time. And that's why it took so long before the Cannonball was open to the public. But then, at some point, they had to start testing it with real people. And obviously, no one wanted to do it. So Gene promised to give $100 to anyone who would try it out. This was enough to convince some teenagers. But even for $100, I'm not sure it was worth it. I mean, just imagine sliding into that thing. The inside was pitch black, and it went super fast, like actually crazy fast, to the point that you'd experience up to 9G. That's like being in a fighter jet. But that's not all. As you went up through the loop, you would feel yourself floating for a short moment before slamming against the ceiling at the top of the loop. Some people even got stuck up there, so much so that they had to put an emergency exit at the top of the loop. And if by chance you made it all the way, you would exit the slide only to find yourself 10 feet up in the air before landing in ice cold water. At some point, they added some padding at the top of the loop so people wouldn't hurt themselves so much and break their nose all the time. But shortly after, they couldn't figure out why people started coming out of the cannonball with weird cuts everywhere on their face, arms, and legs. So they opened up the emergency exit and found a bunch of teeth planted in the padding. But although the cannonball was the most famous attraction of the park, it wasn't even the most dangerous one. In fact, some rides were so dangerous that they were never open to the public. Among them, the Bailey Ball is one of my favorites. You know these water walking balls that you see at the fair sometimes? Well, that's what this attraction reminds me of, except that it was a metallic ball. Someone was supposed to be in this ball, and then the ball would slide on rails down the mountain. It sounds like a lot of fun, and it probably would be if they didn't build the rails out of freaking PVC. And the consequence of that sounds like an episode of the Looney Tunes. Literally during the first test ever, the ball fell off the rails because the PVC had expanded with the hot weather. So the ball, which had a real person inside by the way, started rolling down the entire mountain. And it kept rolling outside the park and even reached the highway, which by some miracle it crossed entirely without hitting any vehicle. And finally, the ball landed in a swamp. Somehow, the person inside the ball survived with no major injury. But fortunately, this was enough to cancel the ride. And if you wonder how the heck was it legal to build this kind of ride with no engineers, well, it's because in the 1970s there were virtually no rules or regulations, so amusement parks could do whatever they wanted. But most of them still preferred to work with engineers to design their attractions. Action Park was really the only place where some crazy guy could submit their ride idea and see it become an actual attraction in the park. Don't get me wrong, these ideas often sounded amazing and some worked great, but many of them were just not safe for the average person. But it wasn't just the rides that were unsafe. What truly made the park dangerous was its reckless culture. You see, Gene's idea was that if kids couldn't go play in the real nature with cliffs, waterfalls, and lakes, then he was going to bring the nature to them. So he built the Canyon Cliff Jump, which is simply a platform about 20 feet high from which you jump off to land in a pool. It's not crazy high, and the concept isn't terrible either. I mean, if you can follow basic safety rules, it's not really dangerous. The problem is that the staff wasn't really enforcing any rules. So people tried all kinds of crazy jumps. Some did backflips, while others ran straight onto the platform only to slip and fall. But the worst is probably that they were not waiting long enough between each jump. So once you landed in the pool, you had to get out of the way fast, otherwise someone would fall on top of you. But Gene wasn't really worried about any of that. In fact, he was the one responsible for this kind of culture. Take the Colorado River ride for example. This was supposed to be like a lazy river. It's literally the most chill attraction ever. But after they built it, once again on the fly, they realized that the ride had nothing of a lazy river. Somehow, it turned into intense rapids that were so violent, it knocked people unconscious during tests. So they had to make some changes so that it would be less intense. But even then, this was no lazy river. And now imagine how dangerous it was with a bunch of teenagers who were punching, drowning, and fighting each other for fun. But once again, Gene wasn't worried about it. He was like, yeah, no, we're not gonna put any lifeguard here, because when you go down the real river in a raft, you're not gonna find a lifeguard to save you. But if there is an attraction that showcases the park sculpture the most, it's the Tarzan swing. Who doesn't want to swing like Tarzan and then let go to jump in the water? Maybe you. I don't know. But for most people, it sounds like a lot of fun. And it is. If you have the physical fitness and coordination to do it. The problem is that most people do not. Because not only do you need to hold your body weight for a while, but you also have to let go of the rope at just the right moment. So the result is that you had people doing belly flops and face plants from 12 feet up all the time. And although it was like 90 degrees outside, they were not landing in warm water. The water was often as cold as 50 degrees. It was so cold that people often went into shock and started drowning. But at least on this attraction, Jean didn't have the bad idea to remove the lifeguard. But if you struggled to get out of the water and the lifeguard had to help you, the whole line of people waiting for their turn wouldn't be very supportive. In fact, they would call you all sorts of names because now they had to wait a little longer. And I'm not even talking about the guys who were often giving the middle finger or pulling their pants to show their butt as they were jumping. As for the girls in bikinis, although not on purpose, they would often lose their top while landing in the water, which was usually followed by a round of applause and some catcalling from the crowd. Anyway, you get the idea? But in all that chaos, no lifeguard ever blew a whistle or said anything. And it wasn't because they were incompetent. It's just what Jean wanted. After all, Jean hated rules. So he made Action Park the land of the yes. It was the only place you could go and do whatever you wanted. And don't count on the staff to bring order and safety to the park. I mean, they were not exactly your average kind of employee. No, seriously, the entire park was run by teenagers. Jean hired kids the second they turned 14, and even people in position of leadership in the park were not any older than 16 or 17 max. Those were the managers in charge of everything in the park. Except for Jean himself, there was literally no other adult working there. And the reason for this is quite simple. For Jean, it was a cheap workforce who didn't complain and just did as he said. And for the kids, it was easy to get a job there. They could get as many hours as they wanted, and the actual work was quite easy. Also, these kids had other things on their minds besides worrying about the safety of the park or its guests. As a matter of fact, horny teenagers having their first time while working at the park was pretty common. It sounds a bit cliché, but it's true. After the park closed in the evening, the staff had crazy parties until late at night. Then, they were literally sleeping in the park wherever they could find a good spot. At least in the morning, they didn't need to commute. They were ready to get back to work. But as a result, the entire park felt like some kind of social experiment. Like, what happens if you put a bunch of teenagers in charge of an amusement park filled with insane customers and alcohol? Because yes, alcohol was allowed in the park. And when you mix alcohol with the kind of people that would visit the park, you obtain true chaos. You see, Action Park quickly developed the well-deserved reputation of being quite unsafe. I know, big surprise. But the more newspapers reported on how dangerous the park was, the more teenagers looking for a thrill came to the park. And they could come almost every day during summer because the entry fee was pretty cheap. So many teenagers came by themselves to visit the park, but many others came with their parents. And while the kids were busy showing their butt at the Tarzan swing, the parents were having their own fun in the bar area. And spending all your day under 90 degrees with unlimited alcohol often led to many fights. But honestly, that was probably the smallest of the issues. And here is why. The beer tent was right next to the racetrack. Because yeah, Action Park wasn't just a water park. It also had an entire section called Motor World. So it was standard practice for guests to drink a few beers and then go on to racing go-karts and boats. As a result, you often had some drunk guy driving their go-kart off the track, laughing his ass off while chasing a poor employee who was running for their life. But it was probably even worse with the boats. Because these were not bumper boats, they were speedboats. But that didn't prevent guests from using them as if they were bumper boats. So all the time you had drunk people being ejected or flipping over and ending up in the water. And because they were drunk, they couldn't get out on their own, so they had to be saved by lifeguards. And unlike the water park, it wasn't fresh spring water. It was more like a swamp infested with snakes, dead fish, gas, and oil. Now some drunk even managed to ruin the best attraction of the park. The concept was so fun and actually pretty safe. You'd get into a small battle tank and drive around to shoot tennis balls at other tanks. And if you touched a specific area, then you would disable the other tank and win. But some crazy dude decided to pour gas on his tennis balls and suddenly his tank was shooting fireballs. So yeah, not only were kids in charge of a park with no rules, with attractions designed on the fly by amateurs, but the average customers was also insane and probably drunk. With all that, it was only a matter of time before a tragedy happened, and the first one occurred at the most dangerous ride of the entire park. Alpine slides are quite common, and they are usually pretty safe. You just sit on a little cart and roll down the mountain on a concrete slide. You also have a stick that you can pull to slow down the cart. Normally, you don't really need to use it, but at Action Park, the Alpine slide was different. And there, if you didn't use your brakes, you were pretty much guaranteed to fly off the slide. But people didn't care. They were going full speed even though they were wearing swimming suits. So they would fly off and scrape the concrete pretty badly. Concrete that was made with asbestos, by the way. And this wasn't just a few people here and there. Every day, you had north of 100 guests hurting themselves just on that one attraction. So much so that the park literally had its own ambulance to keep up with all the injuries just for this ride. Until what was bound to happen happened. One day, a teenager lost his life after sliding off the alpine slide and hitting his head against a rock. And unfortunately, he was not the only casualty. The wave pool was also a death trap. Not only the waves were far too violent and powerful, but the pool was constantly overcrowded. Besides, the water looked murky because of all the muddy water flowing from the top of the hill directly into the pool. Add some body lotion and, well, let's face it, a good amount of poop, and it made it really hard for lifeguards to notice people drowning. They were doing their best, often saving guests multiple times every hour. But despite their best efforts, 2 people eventually lost their lives in the pool. And in total, 6 people died in the park. But it didn't change anything. Action Park was a place where death was tolerated. You see, Jean believed that if people got hurt, it was their own responsibility. But the law doesn't really care about how it feels. It requires amusement parks to have insurance for accidents like this. The thing is, no insurance company would ever cover a place like Action Park. So Jean created his own fake insurance company. And to kill 2 birds with 1 stone, he used that fake company as a perfect opportunity to launder money. I mean, what did you expect from a crook who was scamming people for a living before he created Action Park? But that doesn't mean everyone was okay with it. In fact, a lot of people tried to sue the park after getting injured or worse. But Gene made a point of letting everyone know that he would fight each case all the way every single time, making the trials as long and painful as possible for the plaintiff. So most lawyers thought it'd be too much trouble and they wouldn't even try to go against Gene. But even the ones who did go against Gene would lose the case most of the time. And the few times Gene lost a case, he wouldn't pay until he had no other choice. So if even people dying didn't hinder the success of the park, why doesn't Action Park exist anymore? Well, the golden age of the park happened during the 1980s. It was a time when people felt like they couldn't do anything fun anymore, yet they were desperately craving it. So Gene created a business that allowed people to escape modern society and get a sense of danger and freedom. It was also the last decade of unsupervised fun for kids, when it was normal to see them playing outside all day until dark. And in the park, they could do whatever they wanted. They would probably get hurt, but they would have fun. However, by the mid-1990s, the culture started to change. The overall population now cared a lot more about safety, and it wasn't acceptable anymore to get hurt in an amusement park. Moreover, the state of New Jersey implemented a lot of new regulations that led to many rides having to shut down. As a result, the attendance at the park became lower and lower, and eventually, Action Park had no choice but to file for bankruptcy. Now many people remember Action Park for how dangerous it was, and they get outraged that something like this was ever allowed to exist in the first place. After all, an amusement park is meant to look dangerous while actually being extremely safe for everyone. But that would be missing the point. Action Park never intended to be a typical amusement park. Gene wanted people to control their own fun and to have the freedom to do whatever they wanted. But this came with a big caveat. You had to live with the consequences of your own actions. And if you do stupid stuff, you'll get hurt or worse. And for many, this was part of the thrill. Let's face it, Action Park wasn't for everyone. It was for people who wanted experiences, for people who were yearning for adventures. And for all that, I believe that Action Park was the best amusement park ever.